This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Sandra Stotsky the Common Core State Standards Initiative. Sandra Stotsky is Professor Emerita at the University of Arkansas's Department of Education Reform. She served on the National Validation Committee for the Common Core Initiative from 2009 to 2010. She also served as the Senior Associate Commissioner in the Massachusetts Department of Education, where she is credited for developing one of the strongest set of academic standards for K-12 education in America. She is also the author of several books, including most recently, The Death and Resurrection of a Coherent Literature Curriculum. Sandra Stotsky, welcome to the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Stotsky, let me ask you from the beginning, something for biography that jumps out at me, and thinking about your work testifying in front of numerous state legislatures against the Common Core, is that you were initially a part of the initiative. Talk about that effort and kind of how that plays into this role you've taken on.
I was, at the time Common Core was starting to be developed, on the Massachusetts Board of Education. Its name is now the Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, but it is comparable to all the other state boards of education that voted almost overnight in some cases or prematurely to adopt Common Core standards. But I was involved in understanding what my own state, Massachusetts, was doing at the time to approach consideration of adopting a new set of standards being developed by these two private groups in Washington, D.C., from the vantage point of being on this Board of Education, a citizen appointment.
Dr. Stotsky, I want to hit on something you said just now, two private groups in Washington, D.C. So, and maybe here at the beginning of our discussion, the baseline, the Common Core is what exactly?
It is a project that was funded by mainly the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the two private organizations that developed these standards, and this is well-known information, National Governors Association, NGA, and CCSSO, which stands for the Council of Chief School State Officers. And that particular group consists of commissioners or superintendents of education. The other group consists of any governor that wants to belong and pay dues, and it has its own staff running the actual day-to-day affairs of the organization, as does CCSSO. But these two are private groups in Washington. They do not reflect the states that these particular people in these groups come from, because these particular people are not beholden to the voters of the states. They're only beholden to the voters of the states in their position as either governor or superintendent or commissioner. But the two groups are totally private and may be considered lobbying groups.
So is it fair to say the Common Core is a state-led effort? Is that the best functional description of it, or is it?
It's a totally wrong description, which is why most people have cleaned up the language. It was not led by the states at all. It was led by these two groups with the cooperation of Achieve Inc., Incorporated, a spin-off from the National Governors Association a couple of decades ago. Those three groups were funded by the Gates Foundation to develop standards. The states had no say in it because their legislatures gave them absolutely no authority to engage in any kind of common standard development.
So when we're thinking about the Common Core, and right now 45 states have implemented it, we can be general here, I suppose. What precisely have they implemented? Are are these math and just English reading standards?
That is what they were to begin with. They were two sets of standards, one mathematics standards K-12 and the other English language arts and reading standards K-12 for the most part, with some literacy or reading, writing standards extra that could be used in other subjects to teach reading and writing in other content areas, but there was no content that was associated with these reading and writing standards for the subjects. So basically, it's English language arts and math, and they have been adopted by most states, over 45, and they have a lot of strings that are attached to the adoption of these standards because the U.S. Department of Education attached these strings through a race-to-the-top contract that came about when states applied for money to get Race to the Top, which was a federal competitive grant program. And then there were two testing consortia funded by the USDE that the states could choose to belong to that many state board members thought meant a free lunch. They were going to get freely developed tests that would be developed for them at no cost, and they would simply pay for implementing these common tests based on these common standards. That's all a lot of state board members actually thought they were getting out of this whole deal. They did not realize that there was a whole lot more attached to adopting Common Core.
Yeah, no, because I think that's, and just trying to suss out the public conversation about the Common Core, which is, you've been a part of this, has really emerged in the past year, has a major issue. George Will, one of the leading conservatives, devoted an entire column last month to the Common Core, which really, I think, got a lot of people's attention. And I guess we'll say pro-Common Core advocates frequently say this is not a curriculum. These are standards.
That's right. It is not a curriculum overtly. These are two sets of standards or objectives, intellectual objectives or skills, as it turns out in English language arts to be, mainly a set of skills, very little content in these standards. But the curriculum comes in math because of the specification of the math that has to be taught. And in the English language arts, it comes in through a network of professional development providers and the testing consortia's own curriculum models and guidelines that they are developing in order to develop test items. After all, if there is going to be something assessed, there has to be some degree of knowledge that indeed schools are teaching materials that will relate to the standards and to the test items on the tests that are going to be coming in.
So what I hear you saying, correct me, the testing is going to drive the Common Core standards in the states and actually bring out a curriculum.
Absolutely, it has to. And that was one of the goals, intended goals, behind the scenes by those developing these standards. The standards are what's up front, but as we know, even in the states, and they all had standards because they had to under No Child Left Behind, even when you have standards, they are voluntary in probably most states. They certainly were by statute in Massachusetts because of local control, but it's the state's authority to have and give tests, statewide tests, for accountability purposes, and the legislature has usually voted by some bill that has been passed to give the Department of Education, which is generally speaking under the administrative branch of government, so the governor has the authority through the Department of Education to develop these tests and to give these tests, which then will hold school districts accountable by means of the kids' scores on these tests, so that eventually what you have are the tests determining what is going to happen. The local districts aren't by law required, as I say, to adopt or use the standards, but it's going to be in their best interest to be teaching to those standards if the tests they're giving the kids, for which they will be accountable, are going to be based on those standards. And then the added piece, which is extremely important and which is causing a lot of the new uproar across the country by teacher unions, local and national, what's causing a lot of uproar on their part is that the race to the top contracts required states to develop teacher evaluation frameworks, and they wanted the scores on the common tests, which are to be put into place next year, to be used as part of what a teacher would be evaluated on before the USDE kicks in. And this is the new piece. It's just beginning to emerge, but it was there from the very beginning. How do you determine an effective teacher, and how do you redistribute those effective teachers across a state? This is going to be a huge issue once teachers realize what this means.
Did you say redistribute effective teachers?
Yes, I said redistribute. That's the word. Nobody has ever had anything like this in this country before. Redistribute means that somehow the states determine which teachers are the most effective teachers in terms of boosting kids' scores, and this usually involves a statistical formula called value-added methodology of some kind, but there will be other measures, metrics used to evaluate teachers. And then if there is a large number of so-called effective teachers in so-called high-achieving schools, there will be means devised. We don't know the details yet because this is just looming on the horizon, but it was always there. It was one of the many, many criteria in the Race to the Top application, which had a total of 500 points for a lot of different criteria that states had to check off they were interested in conforming to or promoting in some way. And so once you get some idea of who are effective teachers, and they undoubtedly will be coming for the most part from higher achieving schools, then there's going to be some way of redistributing these teachers so that low-achieving schools will get them. Now, how this is to happen, whether there is to be a stipend, a bonus, or simply an order to move for a teacher to go out to another school, otherwise their license might be suspended or revoked, we don't know. We have no idea, at this point at least I don't have any idea, how the USED is going to try to redistribute so-called effective teachers. And of course, this remains to be seen how the teachers respond in a supposedly free country to the idea that they will be redistributed.
Well, I suppose we redistribute income. Maybe we can redistribute government labor. I mean, that sounds extreme to me. On the other hand, if you think of the number of states where you have court-ordered legislation or legislative-ordered income flattening of teachers across states, I mean, you make sure that a teacher in one part of the state makes the same amount. There's no sort of extreme variations there. I guess they would have to provide some sort of bonuses or incentives to make it happen. I mean, this kind of brings me to a question I wanted to ask you, and that's, you were talking about the teacher unions when you started, and just thinking, how does the Common Core, in your judgment, with the testing, with, although its proponents would not, the curricula that will be developed to support the tests, as I've read, one of your counterparts on the Common Core committee who ended up dissenting, the mathematician from Stanford, who has talked about this sort of lockstep approach to math that has to work to make it all cash out. And I keep thinking, No Child Left Behind lost a lot of fervor publicly. I don't know where it stands in terms of implementation and its ongoing effects now, given Race to the Top and the Common Core. But does the Common Core not just break open like an overloaded ship in opposition by the teachers as the years roll on? Because they're the ones that are going to be left to do this. And I wonder.
Oh, they're the ones being held accountable.
Yeah.
This is the main point of Common Core and the testing. It's to hold teachers and schools administrators accountable for kids' scores. there is absolutely nothing in Common Core or anything associated with Common Core that would hold parents in any way at all, accountable. And there is certainly nothing related to Common Core that would hold students in any way accountable for their performance. The whole idea behind it is to hold somebody accountable that can be blamed for the lack of progress or achievement of students who don't become supposedly college ready. Now, there was some degree of realism in the thinking of the people who concocted this scheme, and they realized that there are variations in student interests, talents, abilities. That's natural. Even within a family, one knows that there is normal variation to some extent among the children growing up within the same home environment. So in order to make this work a little bit better than it would ordinarily work if you just assume that everybody's going to reach the same end goal, the idea is not equal inputs, it's relatively equal outputs. They want everyone to be so-called college ready, college and career ready. The idea is to lower the academic level, and this is why I became concerned in particular. There were other reasons, but this was one of my major concerns, that you had to lower the academic level of what you expected students to be able to achieve by the middle high school years if you were really going to get them into college. Remember, they're called college readiness standards, college and career readiness, and then out with some sort of college degree so that we could then say, we have closed the socioeconomic gap. We have now achieved pretty much equality across the various demographic groups as they are politically defined. And so they knew, the people, as I say, who were concocting this scheme, that you'd have to lower the academic level in math in order to lower science achievement, and you'd have to probably lower English language arts even more than it's been lowered because there's been a gradual decline over 50 years. I'm going to stop here to get your next question in, but this is all part of the thinking behind Common Core.
There's so many ways, questions I want to ask you, ways we could go. Just kind of quickly, and this is something that I've kind of been interested in, what does the student No Child Left Behind? Are the bureaucrats in the administrative state just shuffling it off quietly?
No, it's been wavered. That was the notorious waiver that Secretary of Education Arne Duncan gave, even though many people in Congress have said he had no authority to give a waiver, and the waivers are unconstitutional because he attached conditions to the waiver. But one of the outstanding features of No Child Left Behind, its central thrust, as a matter of fact, was the claim that by 2014 all students would be proficient. And it was clear that no state was going to be able to get, as of last year or the year before, no state was going to get all of its students proficient by any definition of proficiency by 2014. So Duncan's administration, the USED, has developed a waiver, a contract that allowed states to get out of the No Child Left Behind agreement or mandate that went back to 2001, 2002, and they would then, these states, have to agree to the various conditions that would be attached to the waiver, and they may differ from state to state. For the most part, they had to agree that they would adopt Common Core standards and participate in Common Core testing as part of the waiver. But that was effectively getting rid of the basic thrust or requirement of No Child Left Behind.
I want to get to, because I know a lot of your work, and I've read a lot of your various testimonies that you've given and various short pieces and op-eds you've written about content, and you were really alluding to that just now, and the idea that we're actually dropping standards rather than raising them, which is what one frequently hears in support of the Common Core. But
Exactly.
I just indulge me for 1 minute, because something that really bothers me as well is the federalism component, the nationalism component of this, and that is, as we were saying, it gets tied into race to the top. The states take this on because of money. I mean, this happens all the time, this sort of cartel federalism. The Department of Education, there seems to me there is behind just a philosophical problem that I have, that we would have sort of one curriculum for the entire country, in effect, really traversing or distorting our history, where we tried to recognize the diversity, regional diversity, state diversity, and even, I think, tried to be sensitive to the ways that discrete groups of children are going to learn.
That's right.
The Department of Education is barred by law from endorsing, approving, supervising a curriculum.
That's right.
A lot of people have written about this. How does this work? I mean, I could see a lot of legal outs in a lawsuit being filed against the Department of Education, things they could use, but a political debate should be fairly successful. I haven't really seen that being made by Congress. And so my question to you is, how are they going to monitor these tests without, in effect, supervising a curriculum?
The supervision will be done by state bureaucrats in departments of education and through local bureaucrats from the superintendent's offices in local school districts. But the monitoring won't be as necessary as long as the test scores are all there electronically. And remember, all of the testing is supposed to be on computers within a year or two, even though there may be a few paper and pencil tests in a few states because they simply couldn't afford or couldn't install the technology required. But eventually, within a few years, all the kids will be tested all over the country through computers. The information on test scores will be electronic, and that's all they care about. If the kids aren't achieving, the teachers obviously aren't performing as well as they should, and it will be up to the local school districts, which will be held accountable, and states overall, state departments of education, will have it as their charge to make sure that local school districts are performing. Remember, people's jobs may be on the line here. We don't know yet, because this remains to be played out. This is the beginning of central planning. I want to go back to, you mentioned the philosophy underlying this. Yeah. The philosophy is very clearly anti-federalism. It's a philosophy about what some people think are the virtues of central planning. And these are people who have tried to learn what they consider lessons from what happened in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, and they want to take it much further than it was ever taken because they now have technology available to make it all happen. Remember, under the old Soviet Union and in the Eastern European school system, there was no way to be able to have all children take tests on computers so that they could then sort people and do labor or workforce planning based upon computerized test scores and hold teachers accountable. Wasn't possible. So you had a lot of room for dissidents to express themselves at the local level, and they did. And you had hidden scholarship called samizdat, but none of that's going to be possible because the technology is going to enable, in the eyes of these central planners, the central bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., to override all of the safeguards that federalism as a philosophy was designed to promote and foster by having states with their own authorities to do whatever was not given to the federal government to do. They don't care about the Constitution, the people who are central planners. They think they know what's best for what they believe needs to be done, equalizing academic or educational expectations and making sure that all politically defined groups get their share of the rewards of whatever they think academic credentialing allows.
Yeah, thinking about this central planning theme, I mean, so we've got two subjects now, reading, language, I guess one, and then math. But that's not where this ends. Obviously, it goes on.
No, it hasn't ended there. There are now national science standards that are called Next Generation Science Standards, which are worse, by the way, in quality than Common Core's math standards at the secondary level, far worse. They have come out by Achieve Incorporated. That was the third partner that I mentioned very early on that was associated with the NGA and the CCSSO in developing the ELA and math standards for Common Core. These are not Common Core standards, and states have to adopt them one by one if they wish to, and maybe about a dozen states right now have adopted these so-called national science standards, which are pretty obviously lower in level because the math isn't there to support science. And one example I will give is that there's basically no high school chemistry under these new national next generation science standards. Math isn't there to support it, and the all-year physics lab-based course isn't really possible, even though there may seem to be physics standards in these next generation science standards. It's not possible to be taught because, according to a physicist, the math isn't there for students to be able to do this kind of a physics course. So it's very clear that the level of academic expectation is being lowered. We have what is, in essence, the development of proletarian standards for the population, the entire population of this country that goes to schools, mainly public schools, but even those non-public schools that choose to adopt Common Core standards. And unfortunately, the Catholic schools in many cases have chosen to make their curricula as proletarian in orientation as the public schools are doing, except that they're being told that their standards are more rigorous. You see, the people who are selling this speak with forked tongue. They say one thing, but they're doing the exact opposite.
This is something that has been a huge selling feature, right, that you've just mentioned, in favor of the Common Core, and that is to look at the number of states with sub-performing, deficient education achievement, and the Common Core is said this is actually going to raise you up. One way that I keep thinking about this is, what does a high-achieving public school district, say, an upper middle class county, say, a suburb of Boston, Belmont, I don't know, what do they get from adopting the Common Core?
They may get some money. It's not clear exactly what they get because it may have been part of the Race to the Top contract. Different school districts could sign on. If they signed on to the Race to the Top contract, the application form, they had to agree to use a particular teacher evaluation framework that was being hammered out in detail. There would be one at the state level, and then this would, in many ways, override collective bargaining agreements at the local level in states where you have strong collective bargaining, local unions that engage with local school committees on the shape of their own contract with teachers. It's done in different ways in right-to-work states. It still happens, but it's done through statutory authority at the state level that covers all teachers. But you're saying, what are they going to get out of it? It's not clear what they're going to get out of it and whether they can even get out of it.
Yeah.
This is part of the issue that many communities right now are trying to figure out in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire as they're becoming more aware of the poisonous tentacles of the Common Core standards decision that their state board of education made for them, and they don't know whether they can even get out of the state testing, which they're required to give by law. And the issue for many communities across the country is to what extent parents can opt their kids out, just take their kids out of the testing, because once kids are out of the testing situation and there's no score, that removes some of the teeth of the whole Common Core movement. But state departments and governors, as in New Hampshire, are standing firm and saying everybody has to send their kids to school, everybody has to make sure their kids are being tested, and who knows where the penalties will be. It may affect their college applications. It may affect Pell Grants. We don't know. You see, this is all being played out. It's a new game in town, and no one knows what the central planners will devise. They certainly don't care about the Constitution. Let's go back to the question of the Constitution and federalism. They don't care about the Constitution. Common Core has already violated 3 different constitutional restrictions on federal government involvement in curriculum and instruction standards. But central planners don't care. They just assume they know what's best for the children of this country, regardless of what the parents say. You will notice that parents are being discredited in general by most people who talk about the uninformed critics.
No, I think that's right. I mean, Bill Gates has made disparaging comments. We've seen, I mean, and this is something that I've kind of found interesting, are the number of conservative politicians a few years back who signed on to the Common Core. A lot of them seem like they're trying to distance themselves from it now, at least have tepid support. Not Jeb Bush. I mean, I think he's also made disparaging comments.
No, Jeb Bush is one of the problems in this. He's decided to ride to what he hopes will be the nomination on the Republican Party side for president by what he thinks he was able to accomplish in Florida, and he thinks Common Core is good. And he's busy calling his Republican governor friends to tell them to hold the line on support for Common Core, even though there's mounting opposition by parents, including in Florida, which is placing his successor, Governor Scott, in a very precarious position. But former Governor Bush doesn't care. He has other goals in mind, and while parents may vote with their feet, where their children go to school and actually who they vote for at the ballot box, I don't think former Governor Bush cares, because there's power involved in being in some political office. And this is what is driving some of those the conservative politicians that you mentioned earlier. Their main goal is to get reelected for the most part. So they don't want to say one thing very much for or against something that's controversial until they know which way the wind is going to blow. And it's now beginning to blow so strongly from one direction, but these are relatively powerless people, parents. They're not in political office. They can't do favors for other people. So it's a little murky right now which way things are going. States are trying to get out more and more of Common Core, but it's a very big jar of very sticky molasses.
Talk about something that has been raised. I was going to ask you on the constitutional question, are there any lawsuits right now that have been filed specifically against the Department of Education?
Not that I know of, and I've been waiting for them to be filed. People have been so exhausted from the battle over the health care, the Affordable Care Act, that I don't think they're prepared enough to figure out how to structure the lawsuit, the lawsuits. I think there could be several different kinds of lawsuits at the state level, both against the federal government, but even at the state level. I'm not sure why. I've heard that maybe in Colorado some local school boards might try to file a lawsuit against their state board for taking away the powers of local school boards. But generally speaking, that's hard to do because there need to be plaintiffs, and usually children, specific individuals. I'm not a lawyer, but I gather that successful lawsuits require showing claiming that certain people are victims of something that has taken place. And that may be part of the problem. Like, who can you claim as a victim in all of this when, by the way, the tests haven't happened yet? Yeah. You see, this is part of the problem. The lawsuits may come when it's really too late to do anything. This is one of the reasons your very good question remains unanswerable right now. It's hard to show damage at this point from something that's just being implemented and the tests haven't been given yet. By the time that all takes place.
Thinking
it's too late.
of the parents being disempowered here,
Yeah.
there's also the question. Now, I mean, one I think interesting story. I mean, there is this movement afoot in several states, and I'm in one of them, Indiana, and we've seen some mothers, I think, really start the ball rolling. To the
Right.
point now where, I mean, this is another aspect, and you've kind of mentioned this. Even the legislatures were cut out as the state boards of education adopted this.
Oh yes, oh yes. There were four major groups,
Yeah.
as I see it, who were let out of the whole process because they couldn't be bought off easily. The Gates Foundation couldn't give them money. It gave money to almost every organized group in the country, but it couldn't buy off individual parents. It did give money to the National PTA, but majority of parents don't belong to it, and at the local level, they couldn't buy off parents. Gates Foundation couldn't buy off teachers as a group. It did give money to the two national unions. It couldn't buy off state legislators, too many of them, and there are 50 state legislatures. And it couldn't buy off local school boards or local school committees, too many of them. But it did an end run around all of them, it thought, by getting the National Governors Association and CCSSO to use the governors, the chairs of the state boards of education, who are in many cases appointed by governors, and to use the commissioners of education as the way to get the adoption of Common Core standards into place legally, because that is how it can happen by statute. In most states, the State Board of Education has the authority to adopt what it calls state standards, and once those three people, literally 3 or 4 individuals, sign off and adopt a set of state standards, they are state law, and then everyone else has to follow through. Parents have to send their kids to schools which have to follow state guidelines, and legislators find they have bills to pay that were incurred by their State Board of Education without any cost-benefit analysis. And that's why this past year all of this has blown up. Parents are looking at what the schools are doing, what the teachers have to teach, and if teachers want their jobs, they've got to teach what these highly paid Common Core consultants come in and tell them they should be doing. And state legislators are supposed to be supporting education in their state, and if they're told they need to pay for this technology that's required in every school so that students can take these computer adaptive tests, then they have to figure out how to raise taxes or pass the buck to the local district.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I interjected there. I apologize, but I know in the state of Indiana, it was these two mothers. They noticed the math was so odd. They had never seen it. I mean, this lattice method, I think, of learning multiplication. They juxtaposed. I think they had children in different grades, and they were both kind of doing the same thing, it seemed like. And that alone sparked their interest to the point now where it seems the state legislature of Indiana might try and override the Department of Education. I don't know if that'll happen or not.
Well, you have a different problem right now in Indiana. Apparently, while Governor Pence looks good for having paused the implementation of Common Core, and for the most part, and having committees set up to review, it seems that the committees are stacked. I'm not quite sure who appointed the committees. It seems as if the State Board of Education, which was more or less pro-Common Core to begin with, even though Governor Pence had the authority to appoint a few people to the board when he became governor, nevertheless, these committees, when you look at their composition, which these two mothers have done, and they have been now getting ready to write about the stacked committees that were to develop so-called Indiana's own standards and then have an evaluation of them by another committee. And both committees seem to have, for the most part, the same people on them, which is, of course, a violation of the whole process of having an evaluation by one committee of the work of another. You can't evaluate what you yourself have done very objectively. But the point is, if you've stacked the deck to begin with, which looks like this is what is happening in Indiana, you're going to get just about what you had before after a so-called process set in motion by a governor who may have been trying to pretend, we don't know exactly what's going to happen yet, but the governor may be trying to pretend that he's bowing to State Senator Scott Schneider's bill and the protests by the parents in Indiana, both public and Catholic parents, and he will be able to claim that the process took place, except that the committees were stacked. So you're not getting a true process. And we're going to see a lot more tricks like that played in other states because Common Core's proponents, especially the Gates Foundation and its allies among other foundations and business groups who for some reason have bought on, despite what they should have been able to get as independent information from experts who aren't bought out, they're going to support any trick possible because this is political. It's not educational.
No, that's interesting. You raised that. I keep thinking, and what I've read, 15 to 17 states are now in some way questioning or thinking of,
more than that now. Actually, there's legislation in half the states at least.
Yeah.
But this doesn't mean that any of this legislation necessarily will amount to much. The only movement so far that seems to be making a little dent in this poisonous octopus with poisonous tentacles in the name of Common Core that has been set forth by these central planning visionaries, so-called, is the pulling out from the testing consortia first, getting out of membership in the testing consortium that the state joined in probably 2010 after adopting Common Core standards, or that it joined maybe as a result of the waiver that we talked about. And then the question is, what happens if you pull out of one of these testing consortia, which are right now developing test items to be used in tests that will be given next year? There's a few states that have tried out transition tests, Kentucky, New York, and test items being piloted in many other states this year, and we just don't know yet what's going to happen when next year rolls out and the first full Common Core tests are given. But if there are state laws passed now pulling the state out of the either Smarter Balanced or PARCC, the acronym for the other testing consortium, the test that those two major testing consortia are developing, nevertheless, states are still stuck with Common Core standards, and by law, they must give tests based on those standards to their students. It was a very cleverly thought-out trap, and states are trying to figure out how to get out of this trap legally. First step is get out of the testing consortium, and then figure out how you test your own students, because you are still under a waiver, and if you're not under a waiver, as I explained earlier, you're under No Child Left Behind by default, and you still have to have a statewide test because you've got AYP, Adequate Yearly Progress Results, to report to the feds. So there are all kinds of hoops for states to go through. I was just in one state where it may be clear that they'll be able to pull out of the testing consortium that they're in, but then how they develop their own state standards and what they use for tests for their own state standards still remains as issues to be worked out, if they can be allowed to work them out with educational goals in mind, and it isn't totally politicized by groups that want to demonize the other side, because what's really at stake is political power.
Maybe we can end, and I want to. I was reading some things that you've written recently, and you had a piece in the Wall Street Journal, January the 2nd, where you stated that the quality of the Common Core education, that Common Core will actually drop the education for many students in the country.
Right.
And I want to think about that. I also want to think about, you quote Jason Zimba, if I have this correctly in the piece, who was on the Common Core mathematics standard.
Right.
and he's promoted it in public, but yet he's also stated the math component of the Common Core will make you ready for a non-selective college, but not necessarily to pursue a STEM degree, or one presumes to take STEM courses in a selective college. And then also, you've also stated the Common Core was and is about how to lower the academic level of what states require for high school diplomas and for admission to public colleges. So is a way for states maybe to get out of this is to create something you called a two-track system. We actually have an advanced diploma, then we have a Common Core diploma. And
that's a good part of the solution, but you have to understand and make sure, because there is confusion about this. Common Core is not about high school graduation requirements. It's about college readiness, getting kids into credit-bearing freshman college courses. It is not about the requirements for a high school diploma. It steered clear of them because it's essentially trying to bypass the requirements for a high school diploma, which in many states are actually tougher than Common Core's standards and what the college readiness test to be given in grade 11 will be about. High schools in this country traditionally have given diplomas that allowed students to do any number of things. If you wanted, it didn't mean you were automatically ready for college. If you wanted to go to college, you had to take what were called college prep courses. And in math, that usually meant you went past a traditional Algebra 2 course. If you wanted to go to an engineering school, you certainly had to take a trigonometry course or a pre-calculus course. Otherwise, you couldn't even get into an engineering college. But that wasn't required if you wanted a high school diploma. No one would have required trigonometry for every student in order to get a high school diploma, or we wouldn't have had many students graduating from high school in this country, because we haven't had strong enough mathematics demands from early on, the early grades on. It might be possible to get everybody up to a traditional Algebra 2 or trigonometry course level if you really started to make your mathematics demands stronger starting in the elementary grades. But that requires better teachers, stronger teachers, and we're not willing to do what's needed in that area. But I want to get in that the teacher ed piece is critical here. But you've got a lot of problems to work out. Now, you mentioned two types of diplomas. That worked well in New York State, a Regents diploma for those who wanted to go to college, and a general diploma for other students who weren't interested necessarily in going to college, who might want to go into military service, go to work, go into a trade. They could do other things. That was okay. It meant that you had attended school, you were a good student in the sense that you went to classes, you showed up, your attendance was fine. You just weren't interested in going to college and doing a lot of reading and writing, which was what in those days college meant. So two types of diplomas can help the situation, but we don't know what role the central planners in the USED are going to play about getting into college at all in the future, because they may require that if you want to go even to a selective college, you're going to have to take the college readiness test based on Common Core standards, and they may tell the colleges that if you are not making sure that anyone you admit has taken a college readiness test, we may not give you Pell Grants, we may not let your graduate faculty get NSF grants. There are different forms of blackmail that can be used to whip even private colleges in line, but they don't even know what's happening for the most part. They don't see that what's happening at K-12 necessarily affects them, because many of them just keep on admitting more and more foreign students who are more highly qualified than many American students. This is part of the problem. Lowering the standards in this country doesn't mean that our colleges, selective colleges, may not have full complements of students. They will simply be from foreign countries who pay to send their kids here. It's just that we won't have local engineers who have been born and trained in American colleges. There may be huge changes in sight for our standard of living? We don't know. No one's thought it through. No one's asked questions. And as you mentioned earlier, there was no public discussion about any of the implications of adopting standards for which there's no process to even revise them.
Yeah.
This, by the way, is a central question. How do you revise poor standards? There's no mechanism. Anyway, let me stop here so you get in your question before we're through.
No, I just think, going forward, here we are, February of 2014, it sounds like a major benchmark, something that we should be looking for in the next year is the tests and how the tests shake out and how that process goes, because it does seem, if the Common Core is going to be stopped, it may not even be a political debate. It may be something like kind of what's happened to Obamacare is once you try to set it in motion, it's just too big and too cumbersome to actually work.
It may not work, but you've got no alternative in place.
Yeah.
Let's keep that in mind. And so people are stuck in getting the kind of medical care they want. But that's only going to affect people really who need medical care. But we need to educate kids.
Yeah.
All kids need to be educated. And if they've lost a year at the age of 9, they've lost it. Education is a little bit different. Remember, children can be schooled during the years when schooling is optimistically best for them, optimally, I should say, best for them. And once they've lost those schooling years, you can't easily make it up. So we have a serious problem with Common Core. If it really shatters, fragments, deteriorates our public school system, unless you're already very good at homeschooling and have set up homeschooling networks, which is now taking place, by the way, in large rural states, they may be in better shape than anyone else. Our cities are simply going to collapse.
On that distressing note, perhaps we should end. Dr. Sandra Stotsky, thank you so much for your time. This has been wonderful. Thank you very much.
Sure.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.